Hi, this is Shelley Taylor with Joyce Hrinya, and we recently led a governance webinar where we talked about structures for your family business. Two important structures are boards of directors and family councils. And in the board discussion, we wanted to cover a little bit more, but we didn't have time in our short hour. So we are recording some bonus content for you on strategy in the boardroom. So, what are some important topics and questions for your board with independents or just your family as board members? What are some important things to discuss? So, Joyce Hrinya, one of our team at the Aspen Family Business Group, is going to lead us through these.
Thank you so much, Shelley. So we talked a lot about the role that the board plays for the company and creation of value for the owners. And as you're talking about strategy, there's four questions that I think should always be addressed. And as we go through that, one of the most important is what is happening in our competitive environment. So there's a lot of things that are changing very quickly right now, and having a very open and honest conversation about what that is and why that's happening and developing a deeper understanding of it is absolutely critical for your business to really be on top of and for the board to really be asking those questions of management.
So, Joyce, that can be where we are now and what's happening externally, but also what we see happening, potentially in the future, right? Preparing ourselves for what might be down the road.
Right. I like to talk about this as really sort of looking through the front windshield of your car as you're going down the road. You're really looking out as far as you possibly can to kind of avoid hitting those rocks and other other pitfalls that might be headed your way, but alternatively and very positively thinking about what could we be doing to improve our situation vis-a-vis our competition and really grow our company, which is the sort of value creation that we know our owners are looking for. So I think really understanding competition from that forward view perspective is the most important part. I think the second part of the board's questions around strategy should really be around alternatives. So as things are changing, for example, demographic trends are changing. There's a lot of labor shortages emerging in certain industries. Do we have alternatives for what we're currently doing that could help us respond better to some of these external changes? A topic that is in all of our inboxes these days is around artificial intelligence and how that technology could potentially enable changes in strategy that could lower cost structures, enable competitive leapfrogging. What are those changes and what are some alternatives? And I think challenging management to really discuss alternatives to strategy is one of the most important things that a board can do.
You know what, Joyce? This brings to mind that in our governance webinar, we talked about the expertise and the resources that independent directors can bring. And this is an area, what's going on in the external environment, that's an area where your independents can add great value because understandably and presumably in your operating business, you're focused on a lot of stuff that's happening right here and right now. But then you have people maybe from other industries or several industries or, lots of different things where they can give you some broader insights and perspectives. So really valuable here as well.
Yeah, I was just on a call this morning with a CEO of a family-owned business who's non-family, and he said I was speaking to another family-owned business CEO over the weekend at a social event, and he said, "Well, what's the number one value that your board has really brought to you?" And he said, "Well, several of our directors really highlighted a very key change in the operations of one of our key businesses and how the competition was accelerating. And actually, we divested that business at what turned out to be the absolute right time. Because if we hadn't had that expertise with that external perspective in our boardroom, we would have continued on the way we were going and we would have had a dramatically smaller business moving forward. So I think people do see these advantages, but often it's through the advantage of talking to somebody who's been down the road. And what we're trying to do, as you know so well, Shelley, with your leadership, is provide this to people proactively so they're not looking at it after the fact saying, why didn't I do that?
Right. Yes. And we can highlight lots of examples like, from buggy whips to newspapers to film, right? Film cameras, right? Yeah. And a lot,
Absolutely.
hindsight, it's really easy to call them out in hindsight for sure.
Right. Then I think we talked a lot in our governance webinar about really utilizing the family's shared vision and values in terms of the strategy that the business is pursuing. In doing that, what has within that context, which is the most important context, what is the greatest growth potential in that landscape? And I think being able to size that and putting metrics behind that to help everyone understand some of those trade-offs, whether that relates to the family's risk tolerance, the family's investment policies. I think trying to understand that trade-off versus growth is really, really important. And inherent in some of that are contradictions that come from the family's values. We want to be incredible members of the community. We also want to grow the business significantly. Well, how do you make those trade-offs? How do we talk through, the realistic structure of growth within that context? And I think those could be some incredibly valuable strategy questions. And then finally, and this one could be very challenging, but what is not working in our current strategy, right? What is giving us the biggest challenges with the least returns? What isn't happening the way that we want it to? And sometimes this can be perceived as a bit of a sacred cow to some of the family members, but fundamentally, with the type of change we're seeing in the external environment, this is a really important strategy conversation that has to be held.
I just want to jump in and say that this is super important what your culture is in the boardroom to allow to encourage and to encourage these kinds of conversations. So your independent directors, if you have independent directors, or even your family members who are directors can feel comfortable, as Joyce referred to it as a sacred cow. You want everything to be on the table. And then you can have robust conversations and you can still decide to maintain the status quo, right? It doesn't mean so the person who's raising a topic and then also the receivers both have to have a collaborative and respectful mindset so that they can really have those good conversations and really allow no topic to be off the table or off limits, I should say.
Right, because it's often those off the table topics that can really impact and do the most harm to the owner's value. And when you haven't talked about it, you're not doing the job you need to be doing to provide the governance to the organization.
So, final thoughts on strategy and boardroom conversations, Joyce?
I think you really did it, Shelley, and that is to make sure that you have the right board culture to be able to have these conversations and to communicate openly and collaboratively around these important questions so that the group is able to come up with the best answer to move things forward.
And you know what? I do want to say one more thing, and I think we touched on it just very briefly in our webinar on governance, but these are the important conversations to be having in the boardroom. Everyone gets the board book ahead of time. Everyone can read through the financials. Maybe you highlight a couple things in the board meeting, but it shouldn't be a line by line review of that. There should be adequate time to cover these bigger topics where you really need everyone in the room having the conversation and the dialogue.
And like we talked about in our governance webinar, everyone in the room can have very different perspectives. And that diversity of thought can really contribute to the best outcomes. And we had gotten a question in that webinar around having an informed versus an uninformed opinion. I think to your point, having the board book bring everybody up to the same level of understanding of an issue is one thing, but then allowing time in your board agenda to have this kind of discussion is what is really where the magic happens. and everybody has an opportunity to contribute and be heard if the right culture's in place.
Well, that's a great final statement, Joyce. I think with that, we will say thank you to everyone who has tuned in. And Joyce, it was a pleasure doing this with you today.
Same, Shelley. It's absolutely wonderful to provide access to everyone who has shared assets together.
Agreed. Okay. Thank you, everyone.